Alright, so this chapter was a long time coming, but it's easily one of the best chapters we've gotten in a while, and before round 4 even started, I'd have to say that Kamizumi vs Hino was one of my most anticipated matchups alongside Kojiro vs Hanzo. I just expected a lot more nuance to it in comparison to the previous 3 fights, and I think that's because I've never seen a sumo versus a swordsman. It's just not something I've yet seen done in my own experience, and that isn't me saying it's never been done before, but this chapter completely went above whatever expectations I could have had for it. And because this chapter was actually released last month and we're only seeing it translated now, I've known ever since the spoilers were out just how good this chapter was going to be, and now that it's finally here, I have to admit I can definitely see round 4 becoming my favorite match so far in the story if the rest of the fight is as good as this chapter was. And to be fair, I don't think that's entirely recency bias on my part. I think I could reasonably explain to you everything that impressed me here. I mean, even the other fighters had to stop what they were doing to come watch this because even they knew this was going to be some heat. But let's just get into the video, guys. There's a lot to talk about here. So the chapter starts off with Kamizumi and Hino about to enter the cage, and when they enter the cage, we get this really cool double page spread of them just sizing each other up, and Hino's completely silent here. He doesn't say a word, but then Kamizumi starts to talk. He says, "So you're a Rikishi. I've lived for many years, but this is my first time facing off in a Tachiai against a Rikishi. I want to see as many different moves from you as I can. I'll go easy on you at first, so don't be scared to come at me." Again, Hino doesn't say a word, but throughout this whole chapter, you can easily tell that Kamizumi wasn't trying to bluff or act tough here. He pretty much low diffs Hino by the end of it. Of course, we find by the end of the chapter as to why that is, but still, it's hard to even argue if Kamizumi even broke a sweat. So right when Mori's about to give them both the green light to start the fight, we're seeing Hino make the first move here before he could finish his introduction. And by the time we see him next, he's lunging himself at Kamizumi with some kind of stomp kick, like as if he's trying to one-shot him to end this fight immediately. However, it's hard to tell if that's really what Hino was trying to do, right? Because like we find out at the end of the chapter, he isn't even fully awake here, or rather, there isn't a clear distinction as to what's allowing him to fight like this and with so much power, so it's hard to call this kick a one-shot. It's more like that's just what it appears like. And I'm only mentioning this because it's probably important to remember this as the fight continues, just to measure how strong he is pre-awakened compared to him post-awakened. So after he lands the kick, some of the other men watching think it landed, but Yagyu clears it up for us, saying Kamizumi just dodged it. And it's true, Kamizumi's just on the floor now by his foot. He compliments Hino and says that's wild. But now that they're in range, we could see Hino start his next move. It's these open-handed palm thrusts, which I'm assuming is called teppo for sumo wrestlers, and right before he's about to rush him, Kamizumi just thinks to himself, saying, "So this is sumo." And before we could see what happens next, we're getting some narration here, which is actually one of my favorite parts this chapter. It says, "The sumo of this era was far removed from the stuff of the modern day. Sumo began life as proxy combat over the rights to water between rivaling villages. Kicking, joint locks, chokeholds, biting, and every possible form of attack was permitted, and matches ended only with the loser's death. Water is the spring of life. Without it, the people suffer from famine, and with it, they revel in good harvest. Thus, Rikishi offered their lives for the protection of their villages. In a sense, they were guardian deities." And aside from all the sumo lore, I like how this narration is really painting the picture for how inhuman we're supposed to believe Hino really is. Because if you remember in the previous chapter, Kamizumi even asked him if he was human, which was already kinda ironic considering Kamizumi himself is viewed as this unreal god of the sword by everyone else. But what's really interesting is that we know Oda is responsible for the current peace in Japan, right? I mean, that's the whole reason Shibata got a steel fan thrown in his head by Hino for speaking out against Oda, because he realized this whole tournament could endanger that national peace. But as far as we knew, it was just implied Oda himself did all this on his own, but we're seeing now that's not entirely true. He had his own men like Hino most likely provide for his land by challenging the other sumos, coming from the rival villages until the whole country could be provided for. Of course, I'm sure Hino wasn't the only one to help. I think Yasuke is also one of Oda's men as well, so this is just one example of how Oda's men influenced the entire country, to the point Hino's now viewed as this guardian deity. And for those of you who read Record of Ragnarok, this entire narration just also made me appreciate Raiden so much more, going all the way from his backstory to his actual fight. But then getting back to the fight, we're seeing Hino go on a full-on rush. Kamizumi has to dodge him at least 5 times here, and the force behind his attacks are so strong they're able to dent the steel around the cage. But again, he's not even fully awake yet, so who knows if the cage will even still stand by the end of the fight. However, then we're seeing Musashi and his dad now. Musashi points something out about Kamizumi. He says, That big dude's pretty cool, sure, but something's weird. That old dude's been staying under a whole lot of fire without any way to get an edge in, and he ain't even tried drawing his sword. So not only is he not trying to draw his sword, Hino's not even giving him the chance to, but then his dad gives us the full explanation as to why. He says, Kinjite, forbidden art, just as in the Edo period of the history that we know. Raiden Tamemon, a Rakishi with unrivaled strength, was forbidden to use the Harite, Teppo, Sabaori, and Kanuki. Kamizumi was forbidden to draw his sword. But suddenly we're seeing Kamizumi take a stance here against Hino, and right when Hino is about to go for another palm thrust, Kamizumi just looks at him with his eyes wide open and says, I've gotten bored of this, and straight up catching his thrust with his own hand. By the time we see Hino next, Kamizumi is just throwing him in the dirt here. And then the narration then says that Kamizumi's been forbidden from using his sword for 50 years by this point. So we're seeing Hino still on the ground. Kamizumi just looks down at him and says, what you think? This is what they call martial arts. And everyone's either in shock or impressed, but I really like Kojiro's reaction to this. He says, sheesh, I'm stumped. This stuff's far too out of my league to be of any use to me. And this is just my prediction here, but how interesting would it be if Kojiro's only been watching the matches so far to see what he could copy, right? I mean, who knows if we'll even have a fighter who can mirror techniques just by seeing them done in front of them, but if anyone could do that, I think Kojiro would be able to, just because of how much of a legend he is already in Japanese history. But then we're seeing Yagyu and Musashi's dad now say Mutodori. They're referring to the technique Kamizumi just used, where he was able to disarm his armed opponent while being unarmed himself. Ironically, it's actually the reverse here, but because Kamizumi isn't using his sword and Hino's using several of his own sumo techniques, it's essentially like fighting unarmed for him. But Yagyu goes even further, ultimately telling us he's able to negate physical strength entirely. And this next part is so cool. Kamizumi just starts talking trash, but he looks at Hino still and says a haiku. But when he finally stands up, he just looks furious at this point and he tries to actually grab him. Kamizumi just says, so now that thrusts are out, you try to grab me. And here I thought you could do better than that. This old man's disappointed. And instantly, he just leaps through his arms to dodge his grab, but somehow he's able to angle himself around to Hino's back. He says, and while we're at it, before I finish you off, let's get a good look at that face of yours. And he's grabbing one of the horns from his mask, kicking himself away from his back while sending Hino flying in the opposite direction. But it's hard to understand what's happening here because Kamizumi just has to have superhuman strength, right? I mean, to send him flying into the cage by just kicking himself off his back, it can't only be him using Hino's own strength against him. So again, it's like he's not even breaking a sweat here. It's been looking too easy for him so far. But as he's looking at the mask, he notices this needle positioned above where his eyes should be, and then we're getting to my favorite page of this chapter, this image of some kind of demon behind Kamizumi that instantly makes him aware. And coming to the end of the chapter, he's looking back at Hino with his eyes wide open, and the narration says, as Kamizumi's instincts sensed an unknown pressure, and those powerful men gathered there all felt a similar unease, Kamizumi turned to face it and understood. Likewise, Hino, having just awoken, turned to face an unknown aura. At this very instant, two gods crossed paths. And I can't say it enough, guys, this chapter was just so unbelievably good. It gave both the fighters equal amount of hype in my opinion, and I don't even have a preference at this point. I think either of them could win and that'd be totally fine with me. Because now having seen Hino's true face, it's hard to know what to expect. I think he could actually be some kind of half human, half demon, judging by the horn sticking out from his head. Obviously, my expectations for the rest of the fight now are pretty high, so I can't wait to talk about the next chapter with you guys. But that's gonna be the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. But before I end the video, I just want to give a very special thanks to the channel's patrons, Iron Justin and Nix EXP. I can't say it enough, guys. Thank you so much for your support. And for anyone wondering, I just recently opened up a Patreon where if you're interested, you can sign up too and get into this monthly Q&A I'll be doing now here on the channel. I'll be posting the next one up sometime at the start of August, so feel free to consider joining. You'd also be helping me out a lot here in a massive way and get a special shout out like this in every single video. The link will be in the description below, or you could just search it yourself at patreon.com/Izanami. But other than that, guys, again, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, feel free to comment down below what your thoughts are, anything you agreed or disagreed with. And if you're interested in more Tenkaichi, then make sure you subscribe. I'll be doing more here on the channel like always. And yeah, have a great day.